Welcome to a defense of the 3D view of time. Our main thesis points are going to be that the objections made to 3Dism are mainly based in semantics and actually insufficient in countering any of the arguments put forward by the 3D view. Also showing that determinism is perfectly compatible within the 3D view of the world. And lastly, that the 3D view and 4D view are only separated by one's interpretation of the relationship between time and true, rather than any substantial fundamental difference. So moving into section 1, the issues that are proposed towards the 3D view. The first problem we're going to be dealing with is the problem of past reference. In essence, it's the question, how are we capable of speaking about things that occurred in the past in a way that is meaningful and makes sense on the 3D view of time? Basically, if I were to state X used to exist, how is that a sensible sentence that you're able to interpret and has meaning? This objection seems pretty fundamentally rooted in semantics. It seems to really just be trying to pick apart the wording and the way that a 3D view user is using the sentence something used to be. It doesn't seem like it's actually objecting to anything that the view is saying, but trying to pick apart the way that they use the word. And when we look at that sentence, something used to be, it doesn't make sense if you're coming from a 4D view already, because in a 4D view, everything it's just somewhere else on the space dimension. Whereas when you're talking about a 3D view, where even if time is in a constant shifting point and there is no fourth spatial dimension, we seem to intuitively understand that the nature of change makes things that can no longer be still referenceable. Just as we can refer to things that will never be, even within four-dimensional space, and still make sense of it, like a blue donkey. So in conclusion, this is not a problem at all for someone who's really taking the 3D view of reality, and this kind of leads us straight into the second problem. They seem intertwined. This is the problem of temporal facts. This problem seems to kind of be leading out of the last one. In essence, it's saying, if time is a passing, ever-changing thing, and there is actually no past or future, there's only this present moments that's constantly in flux as moment passes into next moment, and as we move through each moment, that the moment before it is lost, and as we move into a new moment, the moment that we're currently in ceases to be and the other moment comes into existence, and this is how it goes. If that is the true nature of time, then how can it be that we have temporal facts? Because where is it true that X occurred Y amount of years ago? For example, a 4Dist can easily plot Manchester United's past glory. It's right there. Back in the Fergie era, they were winning. Terrible now, but back there, the 4Dist looks and they go, look, I found Man United's past glory. Whereas the 3Dist view is going to then be asked, where can they say that they find that true? The only problem with asking a 3Dist is that they don't really see that as a meaningful question. When a 3Dist talks about something happening 200 years ago, they mean it simply as a temporal fact. It's not reducible down to a physical fact that a 4Dist wants. A 4Dist wants to say, where is this? The 3Dist doesn't care. They go, 200 years ago. It exists on an abstract timeline, not a physical one like the 4D space, but an abstract timeline of events. Within history, this occurred, and we know it occurred because it occurred. And it doesn't need to exist in a 4D space for it to have been temporally true in the past, even if the past is not a physical thing. It is an abstract notion that we understand intuitively. So in conclusion, this is equally not a problem for a 3Dist. So that brings us into section 2, reconciling determinism and Treatism. So firstly, let's just explain determinism. All things that were always going to be. All things that are were always going to be. And all things that will be were always going to be. It is completely predetermined. But this does not necessarily mean that it needs to be pre-plottable on the four-dimensional graph. You can have a moment that is constantly in flux and still have a deterministic reality. So let's imagine that I was standing on one side of a room and I wanted to throw a tennis ball. The moment I let go of that tennis ball, and we froze time, we got a physicist into the room to look at the frozen moment, and we give them enough data about what happened in the moments before it, like how fast it's moving, all these types of things. The physicist could accurately tell you where it's going to land. As well as that, the physicist didn't need to be able to look forward along the 4D spatial dimension and say, look, here's the tennis ball in so and so amount of time in the future. That's how I know where it will be. The physicist was able to look at what's occurring now and tell you where it was going to be. The moment did not exist yet. It was not already there in the future, but it was always going to end up there. And that's perfectly okay in a 3Dist view of the world. It can simply be deterministic, and we can make these determinations even when the moment is constantly in flux and the future is not pre-plotted, but is predetermined. It then seems clear to us that Treatism and Determinism are completely compatible views, and that being a determinist does not necessitate having to have a 4D view of space and time. So moving on to section 3, which is pretty much just to sum up what we've already been discussing and point out how similar it is actually to the 4D view. So the things that we've been talking about is truth and determinism. Everything is reducible down to a physical fact. You can look along the 4D world and you could say, here is where this thing is, and that's how I know it exists or existed. And this is where a 3Dist would go, look, I don't need to be able to reduce my facts down to physical ones. They're perfectly fine being temporal. The past doesn't exist in a concrete sense that the 4Dist wants, but the past does exist in an abstract way. The timeline still exists. Time has passed. So really it seems dependent on how you interpret the literal relationship between time and truth. The 4Dist looks along their space dimension and they go, look, here's where this thing occurred. That's how I know it. It's reducible to a physical truth. Here it is. A 3Dist, on the other hand, just says, in my abstract timeline, here is where this thing occurred. It happened 200 years ago, and that moment no longer exists, but I'm still capable of knowing temporal truths about it. Equally, for the 3Dist and 4Dist views on determinism, the 4Dist simply thinks that predetermined equals pre-plottable, whereas a 3Dist says the future isn't pre-plottable because it's not there yet, there is no space dimension, but it is predetermined. What is going to occur, and it doesn't need to already exist on that spatial dimension. So really that also seems like a semantical difference. In practice, they seem pretty much exactly the same. So in reality, the difference between the 3Dist and the 4Dist view doesn't seem to be that substantial. It seems mainly to be based on one's interpretation of the relationship between time and truth, and also the relationship between time and the past and the future, and whether those are things that currently exist in a physical sense or whether they exist in an abstract sense. But that's just our opinion. So what do you think? Are you a 3Dist or a 4Dist?